Hello, everyone.
Oh, okay.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Shinta Hernandez, and I am a department chair at Montgomery College. And I am so pleased to moderate this Maryland online webinar. And just to give you a brief description of what you will learn today, Montgomery College is one of 3 Maryland institutions awarded a 2021 Maryland Open Source Textbook Institutional Grant. And so you'll learn how the award supports significant advances in OER, adoption, scaling, and sustainability in support of our student success that we're doing at the college and throughout the college in the area of decolonizing the curriculum. So I have the pleasure of introducing to all of you today's presenter, Dr. Paul Miller, also from Montgomery College. And let me just share with you his biography here. Dr. Miller has extensive experience in STEM instruction, K through 16 curriculum development, instructional design and teaching methodologies, project evaluation, inclusive professional learning development, instructional technology integration, instructional systems development, program implementation, fidelity, and evaluation, and over $34 million in federal and state grant facilitation and management. He has also worked with school systems in 28 states and presented internationally at conferences on cooperative learning models, systems theory and coaching, scaling programs with fidelity, effective leadership practices, professional development, competency-based learning, and technology integration to support teaching and learning. Dr. Miller is the Professional Development Director for the Office of E-Learning, Innovation, and Teaching Excellence at Montgomery College, and holds an EDD focusing on instructional design for online teaching and learning from Johns Hopkins University, and an MA in instructional systems development from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So welcome, Dr. Miller. I just wanted to let everybody know that I will moderate the chat throughout, so feel free to put your questions and thoughts in there. And without further ado, I give you the floor, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez, or Shinter, as I like to call you. This is a great honor to be here today, and I want to thank the M.O.S.T organization to give us this platform to share our work. As Shinter said, we are an institutional recipient of a 2020 M.O.S.T grant, where we are looking at decolonizing the curriculum. And the presentation today is called Elevating Culturally Responsive Pedagogy, Decolonizing the Curriculum, because I wanted to share with you the journey of our learning as we kind of muddle around in this space and continue the conversations that are happening across the country and across the world into this notion of decolonizing higher education. So I'm going to share my screen here. And as Shinta said, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I will be using the chat box. This will be there will be some interactiveness through discussion through the presentation. So with that being said, you're going to see me, if you're looking at my video as well as the presentation, looking at various spaces. And that's just because I have multiple screens going on, and I like to see who I'm also talking to, especially when we get into some of those discussions. So again, thank you everybody for having me this morning. So the outcomes of the session are looking at the connections between culturally responsive teaching and decolonizing the curriculum and other social justice initiatives that we have going on here at Montgomery College. Looking at the reflection of your current practices and maybe setting a goal to engage students in decolonizing the curriculum at your institutions, or at least exploring the notion of decolonizing higher education at your institutions. And then also identifying tools and supports that will help you with the application of the principles of decolonizing the curriculum. And this will kind of lead us into the work of the grant and the open educational resources that we are developing at Montgomery College as a result of the institutional grant that we were awarded. So the first thing I want to talk about is this whole notion of connecting ideologies. As I'm sure, just like at Montgomery College at your institutions, you have lots of ideologies going on in relation to social justice, culturally responsive teaching, and decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing higher education. And I wanted to take a moment to kind of look at these ideologies and share with you how they really come together from a systems perspective. And the one thing about education, as you're all familiar with, I'm sure, is this whole notion of, this is the in thing right now. And, when it comes to the ideologies around social justice, it's about showing how they are actually all a part of the same ecosystem. So from a culturally responsive teaching perspective, this is something that we control as instructors or employees at our respective institutions. This is where we are responsive and relevant, or we use responsive and relevant practices to ultimately support what we do within the locus of our control, whether it's teaching courses or doing faculty professional development in my case. From a social justice lens, this is where we talk about access with outcomes, equity through intentional design, and acceptance and awareness. And usually the access, equity, and acceptance and awareness pieces of the social justice puzzle, if you will, are underlined in our visions and our missions of our institution. And then when we look at decolonizing higher education, this is about really a systemic change through the lens of diversity, and ultimately allowing students and faculty and everybody as a part of the community, as a tapestry, if you will, to create the vision and mission for the college influenced by the people and the communities in which we are situated. So I want to start off with culturally responsive teaching. And the reason we start here is ultimately culturally responsive teaching is well established. And there are some norms around culturally responsive teaching that are universally accepted. And there are also competencies that are accepted. And when it comes to culturally responsive teaching, the research behind it really goes back many decades. In fact, it was really something that spun out of the civil rights movement. And when we look at culturally responsive teaching as a baseline of our efforts in the realm of decolonizing higher education, there's a lot of crossover in some of the competency areas that have been defined by culturally responsive teaching, but have not yet been defined and widely adopted under the decolonizing the curriculum mindset. So culturally responsive teaching is a pedagogy that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. And you may be familiar with culturally responsive teaching. Typically, most people are have a background or an understanding of how culturally responsive teaching impacts us as instructors or as employees at a community college or an institute of higher education. And I wanted to bring your attention to the graphic on the screen. And from the blue to the yellow to the orange to the green, we're going to number these off. So blue would be 1, yellow would be 2, orange is 3, and family involvement is 4. And in the chat box, I want you to put down the number that corresponds with this section of culturally responsive teaching that you are most familiar with or that most resonates with you. So again, if you could put that number in the chat box, that would be great. Sarah, thank you. Number 2 and 3. Wayne, 2. Excellent. Lots of 2s. Heather, I'm going to pick on you randomly if that's okay. Heather, why did you choose number 2? So Heather, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and just giving us a brief explanation as to why you chose number 2. Okay, that's okay. Candace, why don't we jump to you? You also chose number 2. Would you mind unmuting and explaining why you chose number 2? Oh, you guys are being very quiet today. Oh, no problem.
Too much speaking because I'm in a public area. I chose 2 because I generally teach it from that standpoint.
Okay. So understanding history and culture, what do you mean by you usually teach it from that standpoint? Would you mind unpacking that just a little bit more?
Oh, sure. I teach English composition for freshmen. And generally how I start the class is by starting with the talk on how language has 5 tenets. And it starts with family, history, our location, our generation, and our time frame. So I meld all of those into how we understand language as it is, with the overarching theme that it's dynamic, it's ever changing.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Candace. I appreciate that. Daniel, would you mind explaining why you chose number 2?
Yes, thank you. I'm using my phone, so I'm traveling to DC, so just in case I get disconnected. I teach business, and one of the, so in most of my business classes, intro to business, at BCCC, about 30 to 40% of my students are foreigners. They are international students from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Africa, and even Russia. So I usually, when I teach certain aspect of business, like you want to set up a business in the US, which is a capitalist economy, compared to if you want to set up a business in Russia or Venezuela. So I love to hear students bring that perspective from where they come from. In Venezuela, for example, you can't just wake up in the morning and say, hey, you just want to incorporate an LLC. You have to go through this long process of applying to the Ministry of Commerce, and it might take you a year just to form an LLC. So it's usually all those different cultures. Students love to hear, especially American students love to hear, oh my God, is that what happened in China, for example? I have Chinese students. Oh, you can't just start up a business in China. You have to go through certain procedures. It takes them 6 months. It takes them a year. So I teach is history. It's kind of history lessons, but I do research a lot. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I know where most of my students are coming from. Nepal, for example. You want to set up a business in Nepal. It's not a one-stop event, even though they practice democracy, but it takes almost a year to have an LLC or a C Corp, for example. So hearing from those students kind of equipped me to expand my horizon when I teach certain part of business in the classrooms, and students love it. And towards the end of the semester, we have what we call a capstone project where everybody bring their different foods and culture. They dressed in, it's a business course, it's a BUAD 100. But if you come to that class 2 weeks before the examination, they all wear their native attire, even though you were born in the US. But if you're a German citizen, if your parents, grandparents were from Germany, you dress like a German and you bring your local food. So that's how I introduce that history and culture and kind of align it with intro to business.
Excellent, great, thank you. Angel, you said family involvement. What did you mean by family involvement?
Sorry, a lot going on in the background here.
No problem.
I actually would pick all of them, perhaps. I'm the chair of the EMS program, so health sciences, and we actually have direct curricula on cultural and the impact of cultural. And we consider our interpersonal interactions and communication, all that, some of the soft skills. They're classified as soft skills for us. But that is one of the areas that we spend a lot of time in our program, because we know that if there's going to be misunderstandings, if there's going to be, lawsuits, even if there's going to be this and that, a lot of it stems from poor interpersonal skills and poor understanding of the impact that culture brings in. How do people respond to illness and injury? Is there a communication chain that you need to follow? So there's a whole lot of nuances in dealing with culture for us to do our jobs effectively.
Yeah, absolutely, great. And those are all, thank you for sharing for the 3 people that shared. You know, when we boil this down, what you talked about is really how we operationalize culturally responsive teaching. You know, we have culturally responsive pedagogy where we make curriculum modifications, and we have an appreciation of cultural otherness. Daniel, I think you did a really great job of explaining that in what you do. And then we also have culturally relevant pedagogy, which again, we make those curriculum modifications. But we also talk about cultural identity development with our students. And we actually then take this social justice learning piece into more of an action-minded place where we can actually then teach our students to take action based upon those culturally responsive teaching norms and competencies and expectations. So there are stages of cultural relevance. And when we think about these three stages, again, Daniel, you mentioned some of these, we can transition from this whole notion of kind of surface level use of culturally responsive teaching to an integrated use of culturally responsive teaching where multicultural units are integrated into the lessons and the curricula itself. And then we can actually go to that actualized piece where ultimately it leads to social justice reform across our institutions. And when we look at the actualized piece of culturally responsive teaching, I would argue that this really starts to get into that bridge of decolonizing higher education, which is really where those systemic changes begin to happen and manifest. But ultimately, you know, this is giving students the opportunity to know about their cultures and values and to bring their cultures and values into the educational space so that ultimately they can use that as a part of their learning process. And again, that's really empowering for students. But again, this is done more so at the instructor student level, more of that locus of your own personal control in what you teach or the programs that you supervise, to Angel's point. But there are some myths about culturally responsive teaching, and I want to give you a second to look through these myths here. And again, looking at the myths, if we number them, going starting at the top left and then going down this time. So the first bullet is 1, the second bullet is 2, the third bullet right here in the right column is 3, and the last bullet is 4. Which myths have you heard before? Have you heard all of them, or are you not familiar with these? So go ahead and put the numbers in the chat box that correspond with the myths that you have heard about culturally responsive teaching. Yeah, so Wayne, yeah, you chose 4. We have some 2s again. Excellent. 4. Wayne, why did you choose 4? What spoke to you about number 4?
Sure. The thing that jumped to my mind first about this was basically this is, I hear it less from my colleagues in the faculty. I'm the chair of the English department at Anne Arundel Community College. More from students. When I started, even years ago, in one of my composition classes, I had students do, it was just introductory sort of essay thing, diagnostic essay, but it was about their own personal cultural identity. And I asked them to talk about anything that has to do with their cultural identity, basically. And I got pushback from students, and they said, "Why are you trying to divide us?" Basically. So talking about your culture, your race, your social class, they could talk about. They were like, everybody's the same. Why are you trying to draw distinctions between us? You're being a racist because you're asking us to think about race at all. And they were very much of the I am colorblind, sort of persuasion. And then since then, over the past few years, we've had every year there's a project that's sort of a nationwide thing, but they have these race cards, and you are supposed to write 6 words about race and society and post them up in a hallway. And the most popular comment that I see from students, and they're usually well-meaning, was there's only one race, the human race. We are all the same, like that sort of, you know, thing. So I've seen a lot of pushback from students, particularly about culturally responsive teaching. And when you try to bring in anything about people's cultures, they say you're being divisive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that brings up a really good point about this notion of culturally responsive teaching, social justice, and decolonizing higher education. And that is this notion that, you know, these are really hard conversations. And, you know, from building awareness to understanding to, you know, actually using this as a mechanism and as a vehicle to ultimately create those socially just classrooms and socially just campuses that we will talk about, you know, really does kind of create this gray area that, again, speaks to these uncomfortable conversations that we need to have. But there are some ways that we can really begin to reinforce the notion of culturally responsive teaching. And Wayne, you probably are familiar with some of these based upon the work that you've done. And that's this notion of the big 8. And here are 8 kind of ways in which we can embrace the notion of culturally responsive teaching as we transition ownership from ourselves to our students, and so that students can use their cultures, their values, their norms in order to really reshape the learning environment for themselves. And this really is, these big 8 really are about creating interdependence, individual accountability, and equal opportunities for success for all of our students. So I want to give you a second just to write down or to review the big 8 right here. And I will share the PowerPoint. So if you are taking some notes and I'm going too quickly, it's okay. I will share the PowerPoint through Wendy, and she can make it available to everybody. But which one of these big 8 resonate or jump out to you? If you could just put the number that corresponds to the one that resonates or jumps out into the chat box, that would be great. Candace, you chose number 3. Well, why did you choose number 3?
I think in today's time, it's dangerous to think that we can still be just a talking head in front of the classroom. We definitely want our students to feel like not only they are part of the conversation, but at times initiating the conversation. And it's something I struggle with because it's almost in terms of where I have to do a call and response ideology where I have to say, okay, does anybody feel this way about a certain topic? And just stay quiet.
Yeah.
And occasionally I'll prompt them and say, I can wait.
Yeah.
And that's usually when they, oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's a really great point. And, you know, you bring up a really good point that we've probably all felt, especially over the past 2 years with this whole COVID piece where we've done a lot of remote instruction. How do we turn into a facilitator? How do we get students or give students the opportunity to engage with each other intentionally by design? And when we talk about equity, you know, equity is usually done through intentional design. So using things like, you know, universal design for learning, you know, planning for ways in which students can engage with each other to take that ownership of learning is really key in making sure that our role turns into one of the guide on the side instead of the sage on the stage, which is more of that facilitator role that we need to play. So thank you for sharing, Candace. Sarah, you chose number 4. What did you mean, or why did you choose number 4? If you wouldn't mind just unmuting and explaining that to us.
Sure. For me, the linguistic piece is very, it resonates with me personally because my educational background is in linguistics. I have a PhD in linguistics, and now I teach academic writing. And for many years, I had a lot of cognitive dissonance over that, those 2 experiences that as a linguist, I see all language varieties as equal and valid and important. And as a writer, I felt like the academic institution was demanding that I impose a single linguistic standard on students. And I'm really excited now that there is a change happening in academics and in writing and rhetoric and composition that I can participate in to include and value and encourage linguistic diversity. I will say that I've run into a lot of the same dynamic that I believe Wayne mentioned, of students themselves pushing back against that. Of, you know, students saying, I know that I write bad and I have bad grammar, and I'm like really using the word bad, literally, and I need you to fix me. Yeah. And so that's something that is really, for me, something that I wrestle with and look forward to figuring out ways to make progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this takes us into that notion of decolonizing the curriculum, where we go deeper. We look at multiple measures of assessment. We look at ways in which we can truly have students bring themselves into the learning environment, and ultimately we can use that as a mechanism to promote and engage and reinforce learning from who they are and where they are, as a means to celebrate that too. So when we continue this kind of exploration from culturally responsive teaching into this whole world of social justice, I wanted to share with you the 3 elements that support our vision and mission here at Montgomery College. So we have this notion of access, which has a very specific definition, which probably looks very similar to a definition that you've seen somewhere in your institution's literature or vision and mission. We also have a notion of equity, which is supported by our equity and inclusion roadmap that ties into our strategic plan. And then we go one step further to look at acceptance and awareness. And as we think about creating a socially just community for our students, we have to provide access with intentional outcomes, regardless of the things that you see on the screen. Equity through intentional design. And I'm going to keep going back to that word, intentional. If we do not plan for equity, then we don't promote equity, because equity is not going to happen without intentionality. And hopefully intentionality then turns into, it's just the way that we do things. And that's where that larger systemic change begins to happen, where it's naturally included into the policies and procedures of what we do. And then the notion of acceptance and awareness. It's our job to really make sure that our students have the knowledge that they need in order to expand their perspectives and thinking through curriculum, critical thinking, pedagogy, and the use of culturally relevant content. And again, this takes us into this world now of decolonizing the curriculum. And again, the one thing about decolonizing the curriculum that my colleagues and I here at Montgomery College are really excited about is this notion that this is an emergent, if you will, conversation in the educational space. And as we took on this opportunity to apply for an institutional grant, we looked at this whole notion of decolonizing the curriculum as a way for us to explore and contribute to that discussion. Because again, unlike culturally responsive teaching, decolonizing the curriculum isn't universally defined, and it isn't universally operationalized in a way that looks the same across each one of our institutions. So I want to give you a second just to read the definition. And when you've read the definition, think about any part of the definition that jumped out to you. And I'll give you about 45 seconds. And then instead of writing in the chat box, I'm actually going to ask if anybody has something to say, if you would unmute and talk about the part of the definition that jumped out to you.
Sorry, you said put in the chat the part of the definition that jumps out.
No, actually, if you wouldn't mind unmuting. So if you have something that you would like to share, that would be great.
Oh,
Well, Angel has Angel's
Angel,
hand
did you
is
have
up.
your hand up? Oh, great. Angel, if you can go first, and then we'll jump over
Actually,
to Sarah.
yeah, actually, I would say it is not the structure of the definition. I read that and I believe I understand that. It's actually the title.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, using the term decolonizing is a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it presupposes that there is something bad that needs to be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
With the use of the whole concept of colonization. And I think right now in a lot of our dialogue, depending on whether, and I don't want to devolve this into a political discussion,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it is very possible that even the choice of the terms that we are using to try to communicate with each other and to come to understanding, there are certain terms that are going to trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one for me that when I see this, I very quickly go, okay, this is another way that white people are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, by reading this, that is not the intent
Mm-hmm.
of the Kiel University's definition of this.
Yeah.
But I think it can very easily cause people to start lining up on one side or the other simply to try to defend their perspective instead of trying to reach understanding with what we're defining here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really great point, and that really is this notion of this universal language of what decolonizing the curriculum really means. And, again, this is an emergent conversation in the higher education space or the educational space that is looking at the outcomes of how we create and imagine and envision a opportunity for everybody's cultures and knowledge systems to come together to inform the curriculum. And, so I really appreciate you bringing that perspective. Thank you. Sarah, you were going to say something too.
well, originally I was going to say what caught my attention was knowledge systems, but I really like what Angel was saying. And so instead, I'm going to follow up on that because I agree that there is so much weight around that term. I know that when I started getting interested in decolonization, one of the first things I read was Tak and Yang, decolonization is not a metaphor. And for those who aren't familiar, these authors are claiming that decolonization is nothing short of returning native lands. And so talking about decolonizing it as a metaphorical act is inappropriate to these authors. And it really, in a sense, scared me away from the term. So yeah, I sort of agree with that the title has so much weight.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we've really discussed here at Montgomery College is how do we look at this notion of decolonizing the curriculum and begin to operationalize it for our world. And we've actually gone from decolonizing the curriculum to exploring decolonizing higher education, because again, there are various aspects to this notion of decolonization that exist in many different facets. And to try and bring this into our world and make sense of it and explore it as it relates to higher education is really the lens that we are looking to do that. And I want to introduce my colleague who is my co-PI on the grant with me, who's here with us today, Angela Lanier, Dr. Angela Lanier. So Angela and I are working together to, again, explore this notion and put it into a world in which we can use this as a way to inform our equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy and program here at Montgomery College, and to look at the various things from social justice to culturally responsive teaching and find ways in which we can really make sense of what the whole meaning behind Kiel University here is, so that we can not just imagine and envision a socially just campus where cultures and knowledge systems help inform the curriculum, but ultimately we can actualize that. And, we really begin this notion with the acknowledgement that issues exist. And issues exist from the title all the way down to actually figuring out how this can be operationalized. And, one of the things that we have to look at is this notion that, we do have to recognize that conscious and unconscious bias, racism, and other forms of inequality exist at campus or at our institution. And, beginning to create an awareness of that can ultimately help us have these conversations. And that goes back to what Wayne was saying earlier is, the hardest part of decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing higher education or culturally responsive teaching or even social justice is the notion of conversation. It's so hard to go into a conversation thinking that, am I going to say something wrong that then is going to make me look bad? And, we have to begin somewhere. And that's something that Angela and I are building into a lot of the work that we're doing through this exploration series that we have, that we'll talk about here in a second. But ultimately, given opportunities to have those conversations or a safe space so that ultimately we can enhance and promote diversity across our institutions. This gives us an opportunity to look at those access, equity, acceptance, and awareness tenets that are built into our institutional documents and mindsets and vision and mission, and actually do something with them in a way that allows them to be very actionable and actually make meaning for the employees and the students and the community in which our institution is situated. And in doing so, we hope that as we revise policies and processes and procedures, that the work that we're doing around decolonizing higher education or culturally responsive teaching or social justice ultimately allows for the integration of some of these ideologies or beliefs into the policies that move us forward. And, we're all in a very unique place because of the pandemic, where a lot of our strategic plans and our master plans are being changed in response to what's happened over the past 2 years and what's continuing to evolve because of the pandemic. So we're hoping through conversation and awareness, we can ultimately meet the processes and procedures head on, and they can ultimately inform each other and make a change. But, this really is about creating dialogue, as Angel said, listening to the concerns of peers and accommodating diverse needs is definitely where we need to go. Kind of arriving at agreements. We don't necessarily have to agree per se with each other. We can agree to disagree, but given an opportunity for people's needs and values and beliefs to be heard is truly something that we're hoping to do. And hopefully we can make those incremental changes. So when we look at this through some of the work that we found, this was some work that we found that really takes a look at how we could potentially do this. And, we've had a lot of dialogue, Angela and I, around these 6 different ways to operationalize, if you will, decolonizing higher education. And we're going to have conversations around these because, again, there is no universal acceptance of how decolonizing higher education is to be done across the institutes of higher education in the US and around the world. So, but one of the things that we found were really interesting in these 6 pieces was this whole notion of diversifying our syllabus and curriculum. How do we look at creating a diverse syllabus that includes voices and perspectives of other cultures beyond just kind of this Eurocentric model that we have within higher education? How do we also avoid tokenization of single voices that then take it into that racial world that Wayne was maybe talking about in what he was saying? So how do we look and explore this notion of diversifying our syllabus? And then we also looked at digress from the canyon. How do we learn to let go of the items and ideas that we were taught and empower the ideas and beliefs of others? So how do we explore that? One of the things about being a teacher, and my background's in education. I started off as an elementary school teacher. All of my degrees are in education, and typically I teach based on the way I was taught, and we all do that. We're kind of molded through this ideology of the people that came before us. And how do we challenge that? How do we challenge convention in order for not only ourselves to grow, but to allow for the other ideas and beliefs of our students or other members of the community, the college community, or the communities in which we're situated, to really have their seat at the table when it comes to what is expected at our respective institutions. The third one is dissented knowledge and knowledge production. And again, how do we empower our students or allow our students or give them the opportunity to build on their own community of learning and understanding? How do we bring that into the conversation or bring that into what we teach in order for our students to have that interdependence and individual accountability for their learning? And I think, Sarah, you kind of touched on this in what you were saying earlier. Devalue hierarchies. And this is an interesting one because, you know, our systems are set up to have hierarchies in place. You know, we have obviously roles in which we play across our respective institutions, but also students have roles within our classes that we teach. And how do we get students, again, at the table so that they're involved in the design and the decision-making processes around what is being taught or what is being assessed or how things are being assessed? And we're really excited because we built specifically into our grant an opportunity to bring students into this conversation and actually have them at the table with us so that their voices could be heard and they could help inform the student's view so that we could really create a holistic understanding of how to kind of decolonize higher education or begin to explore the notion of decolonizing higher education at Montgomery College. Disinvest from citational power structures. And this is another interesting one because it talks about that kind of Eurocentric model of where we exist in higher education. And, you know, when we think about things like, like the peer review process, for example, although it adds value, and it has a very distinct place in what we do in higher education, how can we challenge that to make sure that all voices are represented? And I had this conversation at a different venue a few weeks ago, and somebody had a really interesting point about that peer review process, that ultimately, all because we look different doesn't mean that we're not educated in the same way. And that's part of this exploration in decolonizing higher education, is challenging that, digressing from the canyon, if you will, challenging that mindset of the Eurocentric model of what higher education is and how we prepare and how we create this academic space. And I'm sure for those of you who are familiar with that, with peer-reviewed journals and that kind of stuff, you know, when we look at peer-reviewed journals, there are peer-reviewed journals that are accepted in academia, and then there are peer-reviewed journals that are kind of shrugged off or pushed to the side because the people who looked at those peer-reviewed journals or the culture in which those peer reviews were done is different from the Western kind of Eurocentric culture that really drives a lot of academia in the Western world. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation, and definitely one that Angela and I are going to be exploring. And then the last one is diminish some voices and opinions in meetings while magnifying others. And again, you know, how do we get to this place where everybody's voice is equal? You know, when we talk about access, equity, acceptance, and awareness, how do we really live that and make sure that everybody has something to offer in a way that can be understood and accepted by everybody in order to create or to empower and to define or redefine what we do? So one of the things that really is interesting about this whole notion of decolonizing higher education, because it isn't widely defined, and because it really can be connected to some of the ideologies of culturally responsive teaching or social justice, access, equity, and acceptance and awareness, is this notion that it begins with ourselves. You know, by opening ourselves to knowledge systems from all over the world, we gain critical consciousness necessary to see reality. And once we realize reality, we recognize the necessity to deconstruct the colonial barriers that prohibit social uplift. And, again, this is really about having uncomfortable conversations, not only with others, but with ourselves, looking at ways in which we can self-reflect and we can put ourselves in conversations that are safe in nature, that ultimately allow us to challenge what we think we know in a way to be open to uplift everybody else around us. So this is all about change. This is about change, and change is hard. And, typically we tend to shy away from challenging conversations because ultimately, it starts with us, and when we think about that process of change and how change takes place, it really is about that self, task, and impact. So what Angela and I are hoping to do through this M.O.S.T grant is to look at what decolonizing higher education is and answer the questions that you see on the screen. How does it work? How does it connect to what we do? How does it impact me? And what's my plan to do with that? Giving people the place to really have those conversations out loud and with other people so that ultimately we can discover, adjust, and assess through what we do in order to make changes within the world in which we control. Because if we continue in the world in which we control, other people see, other conversations happen, and we can meet those policies, procedures, and practices, hopefully in the middle, and then make those incremental changes. But then we also have to have this realistic conversation that, what's the impact? Is it worth it? How do other people do this? How does it impact the institution? And will it make a change? Because ultimately, this is about systemic change. This is about looking at the system as a whole and how to challenge the system so that ultimately the system can get redesigned, if you will, to represent or express the tapestry that exists across our college communities. So these are the questions that Angela and I are hoping to explore. And I would like for you guys to explore them too. So when we think about where we go from this presentation, connect, extend, and challenge yourselves. How are the ideas and information presented connected to what you already know? What new ideas did you gain, or what could you do to broaden your thinking in new directions in this conversation around decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing higher education, or finding ways to make it make sense for your world? As Angel said, this is all over the spectrum in regards to what this looks, sounds, and feels like. And decolonization is being talked about from policies to country identity. If you look at Trinidad and Tobago right now, they're breaking away from the Commonwealth of Nations, which is that imperialistic view from what came about from the British Empire. And then how can we challenge ourselves in order to contribute to this conversation? Because eventually the conversation will turn into policies and procedures or operationalized definitions that we can then actualize within our institutions. So again, as we said earlier, we did win an institutional OER grant. And what Angela and I are planning to do over the course of the next few months is to actually offer a series of 6 workshops around the notion of exploring decolonization at Montgomery College through specific lenses. So on the screen here, you can see the title or the topics of the 6 workshops. And we'll be looking at things like college and classroom culture, curriculum planning and design, teaching and learning strategies, engaging and empowering students, assessment and student success. And then to me, the most important one is this notion of issues and challenges we face as we begin to explore decolonizing higher education in a world where the conversation is still very divided around what this truly means. So what we're hoping to produce from this is actually a guide. We will be using Pressbooks to create a 7-part guide around decolonizing higher education at Montgomery College and the exploration of that notion as it exists through these 6 lenses. The first chapter will be ultimately what we come up with and what we define decolonizing higher education as at Montgomery, or through the lens of Montgomery College. Our goal for this open educational resource is to contribute to the larger discussion that Keele University, you can see we're in some of my slides, and other institutions that I have in this conversation around the world. It's really interesting. There's a lot of work that's going on with this notion of decolonizing higher education across Europe and actually in Australia. So, we're hoping to contribute to this international dialogue and conversation. And it's definitely one that we will make available through the M.O.S.T Commons so that you and your institutions can explore through the lens that we have explored here at Montgomery College. And ultimately, you can take that open educational resource and add to it too, in order to contribute to this world and this conversation that we're currently living in. So if you're interested, please let us know. You can send us an email. My address is on the screen here. We will be more than happy to share the resources with you. Again, they will be produced as a guide at the end of the grant period itself. And we're hoping by the mid-June or the beginning of July period to make this available, or make this exploring decolonizing at Montgomery College available on the M.O.S.T Commons for everybody to then explore. So if you do have questions, I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to explain more about what we're doing or how we're beginning to have these conversations. And I also have my partner Angela here, who may be open to answering some questions too. So I see. And will the workshops be in-house for MCC or open to other outside faculty? To be honest with you, Anne, we are having that conversation right now. This question has come up a lot in some of the conversations that we've had with other institutions. And there is definitely an interest to open this up. So what we're doing, we're initially going to open this to the Montgomery College community. And based upon the response that we receive, we will open it up to other institutions across the state so that you can contribute to the conversations. We will send out more information as that becomes clearer over the next couple of weeks here. So
Are we
Angela,
going to hear anything from Angela?
I was going to say, Angela, if you wanted to say anything, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think you covered everything thoroughly, but I just wanted to reiterate, as Paul and I and some of the other members of our team have been working through this process, we've had a lot of discussion about the term decolonization. I agree with a lot of what I heard you say, Angel, that just the term itself can be a trigger. And when I first heard the term, that was even a trigger for me as well. Like, okay, how are people going to react to this? And I've spent the last year really looking at different resources and going to webinars and spent some time learning and reading more deeply just so I can really make sense of what this is and figure out how to present it to others. So you're not alone in feeling like that. That was kind of my reaction as well. And so what I'm also learning is that this is a process and it's not going to get solved at the end of this grant. There's not going to be a magical formula for this at the end of the process, but we've taken the approach of we're exploring this and trying to understand it and make sense of it. And we're going to be asking input and ideas from faculty as far as, okay, how can you at least do some of the work to try and work towards this with the understanding that at the end, no, it's not going to be like the ideal of decolonization. So, I mean, it's always going to be a work in progress, I think. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that.
Sarah, you have a question?
I do, because I know at Montgomery College, I think at Montgomery College, you probably have a lot of adjunct faculty, which is the same situation I'm in. I work with a lot of adjunct faculty. And so I was wondering if you could talk about, as you're in this process, you're adjusting your curriculum, what you're doing to bring those adjunct faculty with you.
Absolutely, that's a really great question. And first of all, the adjunct faculty here at Montgomery College or any PD or any series like this is open to adjunct faculty. So we have a very robust professional development program at the college, and we've offered paid and non-paid opportunities for professional development. In fact, we have a semi-annual part-time faculty conference that's a paid opportunity. And all of these conversations and all of these opportunities are also made available to them through those specific opportunities themselves. So it just is one that the conversation is open to them as well as the full-time faculty. We have, I would say, in the summer, for example, 54% of the professional development that we offered was attended by part-time faculty. So, our part-time faculty, we find, really do participate in the conversations and in the opportunities for, personal development through the offerings that we have. So, it's just available to them to participate in. We tend to create opportunities around the knowledge that we have of part-time faculty schedules, so that we can, give those opportunities, not just in theory, but in practice too. So we understand that part-time faculty are working, some kinds of 9-to-5 jobs, or they're teaching in the K-12 space, and ultimately, making some accommodations to make sure that this is something that we can involve them in is a commitment from our planning process too.
Yeah, we also have a part-time faculty institute that's very active and works directly with part-time faculty, so we can connect with them throughout the year and share resources. They help us recruit faculty to come and participate in some of our events as well. So they're very active and made aware. And that's not just our part-time faculty on the credit side. We also have, through our workforce development, we reach out to our faculty that way too, through workforce development.
Nice, thank you.
Well, we have time for one more question in the few minutes that we have left. All right. Well, thank you so much, Paul and Angela, for providing us with such great information on this M.O.S.T grant. And we are so looking forward to seeing how this work is going to pan out in decolonizing higher education at Montgomery College, but also how it's going to help us throughout the state of Maryland. So we appreciate every one of you for attending this webinar. And thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, thanks.